You have to understand sin in order to understand salvation. Now, there has been quite a discussion among Adventists as to what sin is. Is sin transgression?
Yeah.
Or is sin a sinful nature? There might be other variations of the discussion, but let's, for simplicity, leave it at those two concepts. Is sin the transgression of the law, or is sin fallen nature that we inherited from Adam and from Adam's descendants who multiplied his sin? Our own foreparents have added to the load of sin. And now we're passing on an increased load of sin to our descendants. And that's a sinful nature we inherited. It's the reason, or one of the reasons, why we transgress the law, because we are handicapped in our nature. So there's this discussion among Adventists, legitimate discussion, as to what is the basic definition of sin. Is sin primarily transgression? Sometimes we refer to it as sins. Is sin primarily sins, or is there a sin, meaning sinful nature, that produces sins?
Mm-hmm.
I'm sure you've heard that
Yes.
debate going along in Adventism. Helpful debate, important debate, we need to have it. But here's my new idea now, which I don't think is new. I think it's biblical. I think if we limit ourselves to either of those definitions of sin, we still don't understand sin.
Yeah, it's both.
It's both, but it's even more than both. You already know my style when you say both. That's what I'm coming with in this class. We need an inclusive, holistic way of approaching these subjects instead of simply saying, oh, they're an offshoot, they don't have any truth.
Holistic sin. Yeah.
I need a holistic understanding of sin. Yes.
Holistic understanding of sin.
So sin is transgression and sin is a sinful nature, but it's even more than that. If that's all sin was, then we wouldn't understand the origin of sin. Neither would we understand the end of sin, which is what we're talking about when we talk about glorification. Why do I say that? At the origin of sin, we had no sinful nature.
Mm-hmm.
Lucifer had no sinful nature when he originated sin. Adam didn't have any sinful nature when sin came into the human race. In other words, to really understand the fundamental nature of sin, you have to go back to the question of why did sinless beings sin in the first place? And how is God going to solve that problem? Even at the end, when he glorifies us and makes us sinless again, how is he going to guarantee that we never sin after that? You know, he created sinless beings and they sinned. Now through salvation he's going to get some sinless beings again. How do we know that will be an immutable salvation from which we will never fall again? That's what we've just been discussing. Because we're saying he imputes righteousness, then he imparts righteousness, and then he makes it immutable. Big deal, if that's all we say. And I don't know that I have a perfect answer to this, but I think it's a perfect problem that we should reserve in our books to study when we get into the University of Heaven. But we can do some kindergarten work on that.
Good.
But the question is, how is it possible that sinless beings could sin? And how does God solve the problem of sinless beings falling into sin? That's part of the process of salvation. In saving us, God is not only saving us from transgression, which is rooted in our sinful nature, but God is also saving us from the problem of sinless beings falling into sin. There has, and I don't have all the answer because it's a mystery, but part of the answer is that it takes time, even for sinless beings, to fully comprehend the revelation of God's righteousness before they will be sin-proofed. So, Lucifer had to spend time with God, and over time, as a sinless being, he would become sin-proofed by the revelation of the righteousness of God. But he dropped out of the class too quickly. Adam and Eve, same thing. Over time, through fellowship with God, they would develop characters based on the revelation of God's character that would sin-proof them, but they dropped out of the class too quickly. Now we're studying the same lesson, but we have some handicaps. The sinful nature. And the whole history of the weight of inherited sin. But we're still in the same class, studying the revelation of the righteousness of God, with a hope of glory. And what is it that we hope for in glory? That the revelation of the righteousness of God will be so completely understood by us that we will never again fall into sin. Doesn't answer all the questions, but it gives you a framework in which to think about justification, sanctification, and glorification, which is its goal. But if you only think of glorification as the removal of the sinful nature, you haven't really fully understood glorification yet. Glorification also solves this problem. And we have tended to neglect this problem, partly because it's very hard to understand it and to explain it. You know, I don't understand it fully. But I think it's part of the biblical revelation. The Bible reveals to us that God created good things. No taint of sin, no excuse of sin. And these good beings, free moral agents, fell into sin, thereby transmitting a fallen nature to their descendants. God is going to fix the problem of the fallen nature, but if salvation was only about fixing the fallen nature, he wouldn't have to have taken 6,000 years of the great controversy to fix the fallen nature. God could simply say, oh, they fell into sin, they have a problem, their problem is the fallen nature, let me take it away from them and they don't have any more problems. But that's not enough. If taking away our fallen nature would fix the problem, God could take away the fallen nature when you first believe in Jesus. Okay, you believe in Jesus, take away your fallen nature, you're safe for heaven. But taking away the fallen nature doesn't stop the problem of unfallen beings still falling into sin.
Yeah, but and if that be the case, though, it makes us now no longer a moral free agent, because if he would be the one to take it out, then he limits, or he already has curtailed my freedom to choose that he has given me. That's why in the origin of sin, sinless beings or angels went and rebelled against God because of the power of choice. He's giving us that, and that's how love operates.
You are onto something very profound there that I'm sure you will use in your paper. Freedom is one of the limiting factors that God has to take into consideration as he seeks to accomplish his purpose in salvation. Not limiting in the sense that God is limited by it, but limiting in the sense that God chooses to make that one of the limiting factors. He wants free beings. He has created free beings, and his challenge is how to have free beings who are genuinely free and yet will be immutably righteous. Now, God, we don't fully understand this, but let's just work within the structures that we all know. God could have simply created us immutably righteous from the beginning, but it would have compromised our freedom. If you create it immediately with immutable righteousness, then you have no freedom to choose. Because you come into the world and you say, I would like to sin, but I can't. You know? You're not free. In fact, so God didn't create us immutably righteous. And that raises a question about his own righteousness. Because we would be tempted to say, I wish God had created us immutably righteous, then we wouldn't have had this great controversy, all this sin problem, all this pain and suffering, we wouldn't have all of this. And so even I, and I'm sure you have entertained this idea, of why did God not just fix it from the beginning? Is he not powerful enough to create beings who will never sin? Why didn't he just make us immutably righteous from the beginning? Why does he leave open the possibility of sin? And the enemy would have us to raise the question, and it's a very natural question, of whether God is wise enough, since he made the mistake of creating beings who could fall into sin. So his character and his wisdom is called into question. You know, and is he not in some way responsible for this sin? If he created the ones who did it, shouldn't he have taken more time with the planning of the creation so that it wouldn't happen? So his character is in question in part, because he has chosen to create free beings. So it's still a mystery that will not be fully explained until the end. But the fact that it's a mystery and it cannot be fully explained doesn't mean that we should ignore the reality of it. Because if we ignore this reality, then we reduce salvation to simply getting rid of the nature. But it has to be more than that. You see? Because getting rid of the nature doesn't necessarily fix the problem of freedom. Sinless beings are still free to choose to rebel against God's law, even in their sinless nature. One of the things we need to wrestle with is, how can that be? We need to restructure our thinking of what sinlessness means in order to understand how a sinless being can still sin. Because we have tended to think that the reason we're sinning is because we've got a sinful nature, which is partly true, but not completely true.
Yeah.
Paradoxes.
You see?
Or,
Because sinless beings sinned. And of course, you know, this is going to get us into the hot water Adventist debate about the nature of Christ, who did not sin, raising the question of whether or not he had a fallen nature.
Prelapsarians.
So, yeah.
But we don't want to get bogged down. We want to talk about that, but we're not going to get bogged down into that. We just want to realize that's part of the reason why we debate about those issues. Because this is what it's all about. So Jesus came to show us what we can be in human nature, but he also came to show us the character of God. Now, would you agree with me that God is immutably righteous?
Yes.
God has never sinned and is never going to sin, and yet God is free. Some people think God doesn't sin because he can't, but God doesn't sin because he doesn't want to.
Yes, yes.
And if God is omnipotent and he doesn't want to sin, who can make him sin? So God is immutably righteous, you see? But God is going to share his immutable righteousness with people who are not omnipotent. Through a relationship with the omnipotent God, we will have the omnipotent power to live without sin throughout eternity. But that power is not simply based on the fact that we just didn't have a sinful nature. Got to be more than that. It has to be the revelation of the righteousness of God to us through a relationship with God, which takes time. Because something about freedom and the way God is and the way he created us means that there is a historical process of fellowship with God that results in a growth in righteousness even for sinless beings, until those sinless beings learn how to fully and permanently receive the immutable righteousness of God. Still a lot of mystery. A lot of mystery. Don't ask me questions about explaining it further. Because that's a mystery that cannot be fully revealed to us in our present time and space. We can't go down and explain all the ins and outs and nitty-gritties of that. But I think if you think about it, you will see that this is part of the biblical presuppositional framework. The biblical framework presupposes all that we've just said, even though we don't understand it fully. Sinless beings sinned. So sin is not primarily a problem of a fallen nature. The fallenness of the nature is a secondary complication. The primary issue is, how is it possible for sinless beings who can fall into sin to become immutably righteous as God is? And the whole great controversy is a progressive revelation of how that can be. And we're still in kindergarten today, so we don't fully understand it, but we can believe it. Yes, Dan?
I think